I'm Dolores Cannon, and I've been a hypnotherapist for 18 years. I started in 1979, and I specialize in past life therapy and past life regressions. This is where you take the person back into the other lifetimes to find the answers to problems in this lifetime. So I've been doing this as a hypnotherapist for 18 years. And 10 years ago, they asked me to be a UFO investigator. They needed someone who could use hypnosis into the abduction cases, and they wanted someone who could take them back into that. So they asked me to come in as an investigator to help them on those cases.
So how did you get started in doing this?
Okay, but my roots in hypnosis actually go back into the 1960s. So I was trained in the old methods, the watch the shiny object, the ones that are very long inductions, and those are not used anymore. They're too time consuming. And during those early days of doing habits, losing weight, stop smoking, by accident, a woman we were working with went back into a past life. And it was the beginning of this whole adventure. There were no books in that time to guide you, no books to tell you how to do this. We were more or less blazing our own trail of how to do reincarnation hypnosis into that. But even though it was a very startling case and it changed my whole belief system on what's out there, I had to put it on the back burner. I had to wait until my children were grown, because my husband was almost killed. He was in a wheelchair for 25 years. Our whole life was changed. And I had to wait till my children were grown before I could pursue hypnosis again. So in 1979, they were married and off to college, and so I was like, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? What I chose to do with the rest of my life is not what the normal housewife chooses to do. I wanted to get back into hypnosis, and I wanted to become a writer. So I studied the modern methods, which are much faster. They deal with visualization and imagery. And from there, I developed my own technique, which puts the person into the deepest possible level of trance, which is the somnambulistic level. You can't go any deeper than that, but many hypnotists do not want to work in that level because strange things can happen there, because all the conscious mind interference into that level. And that's why I think I'm getting a different kind of information than the other UFO investigators. I work in this deep, deep level. I'm able to contact the subconscious directly. Many other of the UFO investigators are staying in what is called the emotional level. They don't go into the level where you find the real information. In the emotional level, the person may be remembering some snatches of an event, or they may be having dreams, and all they can remember is that something horrible happened, is the way they interpret it. They think it's something very evil or menacing. And a lot of the investigators, they keep them at that level, and there's a great deal of fear based there. But when I take the person back and they are on board a craft, I go beyond that to where they're no longer frightened, to go to the subconscious and say what is really occurring. And when I do that, we find there's a whole other set of circumstances, because the subconscious knows what really is going on. And it will tell you the exact procedures and everything. And it's really not frightening at all. The person has remembered it through a distorted memory.
So how did the first alien memory surface in a past life?
Well, the first case that I ever did was actually before I began doing investigations. It was a young man, the subject of my book, Keepers of the Garden. I call it Keepers of the Garden because it's we are the garden and they are the gardeners. It's the ancient astronaut theory that the Von Däniken first coined that term a long time ago, talking about the seeding of the planet Earth. And this young man, we just wanted to go back and look for past lives. Instead, we found that this was his first life on Earth. He had never lived on Earth before. All his other lifetimes had taken place on other planets and other dimensions. So I thought this would be interesting, and we went through these different lifetimes. And then suddenly, they began telling us the story of the seeding of the planet Earth and the beginnings of Earth. And it was very fascinating, going back to the beginning of time. And it was the book was finished, and I was sending it off to publishers when I got into the UFO work. And the young man, Phil, told me that for years he had had these strange dreams. And he had had an experience where he woke up very frightened many years before. And he said, do you think there's anything to that? In the early days of my investigation, I thought the person had to have an actual sighting, to have actually seen something physical or remembered something happening to them. I didn't realize that the capacity of the subconscious to hide things, which is better, they don't have anything to disturb them all their life. It's hidden in the subconscious, but in order to have a conscious memory. So when he's telling me about waking up in the middle of the night, absolutely terrified and having these strange dreams, I thought there's nothing to it. But we pursued it anyway, and we found a whole another hidden list of experiences there. He had contact since the time he was 10 years old, and he'd been on the craft many times, and he was part of the experiments. And they said it was because in the other lifetimes he was the alien, he was the experimenter, that now in this life he had agreed to be on the other side as the experimentee. And so that book, I ended up adding 4 more chapters to the end to show how it comes full circle, the reason why they were still coming. But it was something that was unknown to either one of us. But with the idea of the seeding of the planet Earth, they have been taking care of us since the very beginning. And there are councils, we are told, over different levels. And they are over different galaxies, over solar systems. There's different, like a pecking order over there. And they have definite rules and regulations that they go by. And they said when a planet reaches its state where it can support life, has developed to that stage, it is given its life charter. This means then that the different races will come here and try to determine what kind of life will grow here. And they have to experiment to find out what it is. And it goes from the cellular stage, and they watch it as it develops. This is a very long, time-consuming process. It will go on for eons of time, with different people being involved in the development of the race. And it was decided to give Earth a creature with knowledge and free will, and see what he does with it. And I've often wondered, what do they think we're doing with this free will? Are we doing what they intended? And the Star Trek directive of non-interference is very real, because once they give it, you're not supposed to interfere, see what they'll do with it and how they will develop it. And it was also supposed to be a race that would never get sick and would never die, the perfect being. And it's like the legends of the Garden of Eden, really. A perfect place was what it was supposed to be. But then, according to the story we had, it was spoiled when a meteorite crashed to the Earth. And this was a chapter I called Weeds in the Garden. Suddenly, contamination occurred on the planet and it was spoiled. Because when the meteorite crashed, it brought bacteria to the Earth for the first time. And they knew it would be the new developing being would be exposed to disease, and it would eventually die. It would have the life would not be for as long as it was supposed to be. It would have a definite termination point, because you would have disease and death. And this was not what they wanted, but it was like, what do we do now? Do we throw it all out and start over again, or what? But they decided it had gone so far to let it keep developing as it was, even though it would never be the perfect being that it was intended to be. It was very sad whenever it happened. And it's interesting that during the last year on a nova, they were talking about the different forms of life on Earth. And they said there were only 2 life forms on Earth. One is bacteria, and one is everything else. Which is interesting, because the story we had was that the meteorite brought bacteria to Earth. This means that bacteria is foreign. It is not like anything else on Earth. Everything else, man, animals, and plants are all related in some way, and bacteria is totally separate. So it's interesting that it does go along with what we were told. But to bring it up to date, the reason they are still coming and experimenting, they are still trying to get us to the point where we would be the perfect human being that they intended in the beginning. And they're doing experiments to find out the effects of the environment on the race, the pollutants in the air, about the increase in cancer in the bodies, that this, how it's affecting the human being. And they're trying to develop cures and medicines that will help us. So if people look at it from that direction, it's not a frightening aspect. This is why they have followed whole generations of families. I have had cases where I've taken them back through the subject, their parents and their grandparents. They've all been watched and had these experiments all their lives. But it doesn't bother them. Most of the time the memories are hidden. But it shows it's more or less like a laboratory setting. They come in to see how we're doing and to try to help us in some way. And they said the perfect case would be that the person never remember anything that was done. They want them to go on with their life living normally. The problem is that there's so much chemicals in our body now and so much chemicals in the air, and we have drugs in our body just from medications. We have alcohol. Anything like that affects the way the person perceives the event. And they may remember it in a very distorted fashion because of the chemicals in their body. This is why we're having more of these memories surfacing, and they're not accurate memories. So I think these things can explain some of the more horrifying cases you hear about. It's not really what happened. The mind from a fear, and the fear is one of the most strongest emotions there are, will color whatever has occurred.
Can you go back? You talked about a little bit about the evolution of the Earth and how it began. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, as I said, they had to wait until the Earth cooled down. In my book, Legacy from the Stars, I have people went to lifetimes where they were living as aliens in other planets and other dimensions. But we had one young man who wanted to go back to his first life on Earth. And he went to a time where he was part of the atmosphere, which shows you don't have to have a physical body. The intellect is there. It can exist in any form it wants to. I was thinking he was going to go back to a caveman, but he went back to when the Earth was cooling down. There were erupting volcanoes and lava everywhere, and the air had to be clarified so that life could begin to form. There was a lot of sulfur and a lot of pollutants in the air, and part of his job was, with many others, to filter the air. So you don't have a body. You exist, but it's more or less like an element, which is one of the basic forms before you reach a human body, which shows you can even live as pure energy in some of the other dimensions. But his job was to filter the air until the air cooled down enough that life could begin to form. The story was that they began with a cellular level and begin to develop life. And it was pruned and taken care of as it grew to take out the undesirable traits to develop into man. As it evolved into the animal stages, they had to choose the animal that would be the most intelligent and be able to use its hands, be dexterous. It would have to be some way that it could function. So this is why they picked the monkeys, because they were the closest to what they wanted. So they interbred, genetically, in the laboratories, different genes from their races and other races in the galaxy to develop the chimpanzee to where it would have the intellect. They said there were a lot of surgery had to be performed to develop the hands to where you could have the opposing thumbs. Say the chimpanzees and man are 99% genetically compatible. Totally different from each other. But man and the chimpanzee are almost a perfect match. So it backs up the fact, I know people don't like to think of that, but that we did come eventually from this evolution type thing. It took eons of time, and people have asked me, well, what race of being was responsible? It was not just one race, it was a whole lot of them, because they all had different parts to play. As though this would be a military station, and they would come and do certain things, and then they would have to go off somewhere else, because it was taking an enormous amount of time to do all these things. And as it developed along the way, as they got more and more intellect, then there would be beings that would come at different times to to know. In every culture in the world, you have what's called the culture bringer. All the legends of the world, the Indian legends, the Egyptian, someone always comes from the stars or from across the ocean to bring them agriculture, to tell them how to hunt, to tell them how to plant. Every time they need something, the legends will say someone came and told them how to do it. They have research into Indian legends from my book, The Legend of Star Crash, and these are all over the world. And even in the Mexican legends, Quetzalcoatl, all of these gods and goddesses. Eventually they were worshipped as gods and goddesses, even though they did come from other planets and they came in spacecraft. Because you can imagine a primitive person seeing someone land in a spacecraft and they wouldn't know what it was. They would say the gods descended. And a lot of things in the Bible go along with this also. But each time mankind reached a point where he had to have something, they would give it to him as a gift. Sometimes they would misuse it, as in the case of the Mayans whenever they turned to sacrifice. They were trying to teach them surgery and how to take care of each other, but it was distorted after certain priests would die. And they would change the meaning of it until it became cut the heart it open and present the heart to the gods, rather than was trying to show you how you could take care of the body. And I asked them, well, if you told it to them once, why couldn't you come back and say you're not doing it right? We showed you how to. They said they couldn't do that. That would be interference. They could give it to them as a gift one time. What man chose to do with it was in their own hands. They could not change it. But as the world became more and more populated and more people, then they could not come direct doing it mentally, sending the ideas for the next inventions that would benefit the world. And when an invention comes, many people all over the world will have the idea at the same time. And it's always a matter of who can get it to the market first. They don't care as long as it is in the hands of man at the time it's needed. And you'll hear a lot of this where everybody's all thinking the same idea, almost as though it's in the atmosphere and everyone gets the idea at the same time. Ideas ever since that time, whenever there began to be too many people. And it's still occurring now, that we are being fed ideas when the time is right. But if you'll notice, they've always been positive ideas. But then it's the way man turns it. You can turn anything into a weapon. You can misuse anything. But it began with people. So they have been called the Watchers by many people because they've been watching us since the beginning of time, taking care of us, afraid of us. If we wanted to hurt you, we could have done it a long time ago. And why do you think we're here to take over the world? The world is ours. Has been forever. And man does more horrible things to each other than they could ever do to us. This is the way I look on my work, as a positive experiences. If you want to know if there is a God over it all,
yes.
Anyway, yes, even the aliens that I've worked with in these different cases all believe in a creator being. Many of them call it the source, because many of these beings don't consume food like we do. We're different. We're the unusual ones because we eat. And when we eat, we consume the life energy of that plant or of that animal. Many of them live on light and cosmic energy, and they say it comes from the source. And they all recognize the source. They call it that, or they'll call it the creator. But they are much closer to it than we are because we don't have the religious dogma in the way and the theology. They understand where they came from. But in my book, Legacy from the Stars, I say that we are all aliens. It is a young planet in the history of the cosmos. Hasn't been here that long. The other planets have been there a long time. Our soul is immortal. It's been around forever. And it will continue to be around forever. So it's had many, many adventures. So we have all aliens, unless we just decided to come, recently. If you trace us back, you're going to find many of us have had lifetimes as aliens in different experiences. This is only a stopover right now to have physical experiences, to live in a human body with limitations and with the limited experiences and to experience emotions It's a totally different experience than living on a planet where you can create anything you want by mind power as energy. Each life on any dimension or planet, we are learning new experiences. So now we're in the human form. We may decide after we die this time to go to another planet, another dimension, or we may come back here until we complete all of our lessons. But the soul is the same, whether it's the alien soul or whether it's human. They were all created by God, as we call them, and as they call it, the Creator. And the Creator is the one behind all of the seeding of the planets. I asked them one time, couldn't you let life just develop indigenously on the planet? They said it could, but it would be much slower, it would take much longer, and it would not go the right way that they intended it to. So this is why they would direct it to go in different directions. But it said God is the creator, the others are the children doing the work.
Okay.
In that way. So this way it is not, it puts it into a,
Yes.
makes it a lot more to it.
How about aliens who came to Earth by accident that were trapped in the physical because of karma?
All right. Those are unusual cases. I don't think very many people have had those. But the cases where souls have not supposed to have been here. The majority of people who I call our star children they are like a soul, and they have come through and been born as a baby. They just don't have the memory consciously that they are a star child. But in the past, there were many others that came by accident and were caught here. And in Legacy from the Stars, I had 2 cases where they came by accident. One of them was a little being who was a little craft, and his job was to map. He was supposed to be mapping the continents or whatever. That was his job. And he crashed by accident. And he kept saying, this shouldn't have happened. I'm really a very good pilot. But he was this little alien being, and he crashed in these high snow-covered mountains. Of course, this was a long time ago. We had no way of knowing when it was. And when the people found him and took care of him, they were very afraid of him because he could float, and he glowed, and he looked like these little beings. And so they kind of turned him into a god. But he was more or less trapped there. He said, something had happened to his head. He'd hit his head whenever he crashed, and that was how he controlled the craft, how he communicated with the other beings. So it was like he was trapped, and he was very unhappy, very lonely to be there. But to pass the time, he thought, well, he'd teach these people, these natives, how to do things. And he taught them how to build buildings and how to build bridges. He said, I'm bored, I've got to do something. But finally, after quite a while, he just said, I'm not glowing anymore. He said he had lived through generations of these people, and they had statues to him, they were treating him like a god. But he said, I think something's wrong, I might be sick or something, because he said, I'm not glowing anymore. Well, eventually he just faded away. This is the way they do. They disformulate their bodies, is what he said. And I thought, well, he'd be able to go back to where he belonged now because he was so lonely. He says, no, I am trapped here now because I interfered with the culture. I taught them things they were not ready to do. So now I have to be physical to go out this whole life cycle. So sometimes they do get trapped here because they create karma in that way. And I don't think these theories have been brought out by very many people. But so there's a plan to it all. It's very strange, but there's always plans.
Was there any interbreeding with this alien?
No. I'm just a lonely, poor little creature,
Have there been any cases of that, of interbreeding with that?
Oh yeah, that's in my book, Legend of Star Crash.
Yeah. So explain a little bit about the hybrids.
Okay, the ones we're talking about with that? Okay. We had an interesting case that is in my book called The Legend of Star Crash. And this happened through past life regression, just like the cases in the Legacy from the Stars. The woman went back and was reliving a lifetime where she was a native, was in the Canadian-Alaska region, and they were isolated. It was a tribe of people, and so they had kept the legends of their people pure. They thought they were the only people in the world, and they had told the stories of their beginnings so many thousands of years that they repeated this. There was no contamination from the outside. But the story was At first it was in very crude language, you know, about the old ones coming across the void in a ship in the river, and they kept saying, how could it do that, because it was made out of metal. But as I went through the story, I got the equivalent of what occurred. There was a group of 5 ships that were going from another planet to establish a colony somewhere. And as they were like the Noah's Ark, because they were generational ships. People lived on these craft for many generations. They born and died there, and they had all the food they wanted. They had animals. They grew food on the ships because they were going to set up the colonies. And as they were going through our near Earth, one of them had trouble, and he crashed in the Canadian-Alaska region. And they found out when they got out of the craft, the radiation of the sun was so strong they couldn't take it. They had to live inside the craft for quite a while. But also, can you imagine the feeling of people who have been living all their lives in a craft, finally getting out and seeing these open spaces? It was horrifying to them. I think it's called agoraphobia, when all of a sudden, you know, there's all this space. But the sun was so bright they couldn't take it. So their children were being born dead or being born deformed because they could not exist. The radiation was affecting their bodies. The only way to survive was to interbreed with a group of Aborigines that were living in the same valley. This was before the coming of the Eskimos, so it was way back. And as they interbred with these Aborigines, their children were surviving. And these were beings that had beautiful white hair. It's on the cover of the book, the best way I can get them. They had a silver-like glow to their skin, which was caused by the oil in their skin. And they were very handsome, very good-looking people. But when they interbred, the first children had blue hair, and they had these darker genes that were influencing the way the children looked. After a few generations, the dark genes began to predominate over these very light-colored. And the story is that this was the beginning of some of the Indian races in the North American continent. And there are some diseases that we were told are traced back to these genes. And so I did a lot of research to trace these diseases down. The story we had, though, was many years later when the Eskimos finally did come across the Bering Strait and come into that area. Then they interbred with their legends and their stories. So the stories have been they're contaminated ever since. But these Eskimos that have written to me said that the stories are there, and they said this makes sense to them. But one man who lives up there, who was a UFO investigator, said that the descriptions we gave in the book of the river, it was a tributary of the Yukon, and the description of the land, he said he knew exactly, he thought, where it was. And I've never been to Alaska. The woman who I was working with had never been to Alaska. He thought if we were to go up there and take a seaplane and a metal detectors, he thinks he could find where these craft were, because after they crashed, the natives buried these pieces as holy pieces. But is it a metal that could be detected? That's something we don't know. They did use pieces of the metal for many, many generations for their tools, and they said it never wore out, never broke. But I don't know if we could find it or not, but this man says because of the description we gave, he knows exactly the area where it could be. So after that, you go further north, it turns into tundra where there's no trees or anything. This is quite amazing, I think, that people are able to pinpoint.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, what do you think, where is it going to go from here? What's the next step?
Well, the next step, they want us to be this perfect being. One thing that's interesting is coming out now in some of the cases, has never come out before. I believe Whitley Strieber has touched on it in his new book, and I've been getting information on it, is that now not only the experimentations are taking and the samplings are taking place on board the craft, but they're going to the schools. That on the larger craft especially, there are schools that are teaching all kinds of laws of very complex. And I've had several cases where they've done this, and they don't understand what they're getting, but it's like it's all being poured into their mind. Some of them say when they're laying it on a couch at home, even at night, it's like it's being beamed into their head. They can't understand it. They can't slow it down enough to tell me what it is. It's geometric designs and flashes, and it's all being poured in. And some people have been writing me saying, and all this information is coming into their head, can I help them get it out? Well, what I was being need later, as we go into this changing times and into the millennium, almost like a time release, time is right, all this information will come forward, and we will have it for what we need at that time. So we are evolving into a different type of a human being. As Nostradamus said in the books, that it's a raising of the consciousness of the people. Next time we are going to be functioning from the psychic level and using our psychic abilities more and more. So that this is where we're going. We're going to be developing this and turning into a different type of a human being. But you know, in Atlantis, they did this. They had evolved to the point where they were using total mind control, and they abused it. Being humans, they got bored and they tried to use it for the wrong things, and this is one of the reasons why Atlantis went down. They began using mind power in the wrong way. So after that, it was more or less like short-circuited. You will not use this again until you are ready for it. And some of the remnants of Atlantis were the ones that built the pyramids and used the levitation to raise these huge blocks. But we have not been able to redo until now, and now we are getting into the area again. We will be doing this totally. And I was told those who have negative karma to replace will not be sent here anymore. The planet is evolving beyond. They have something negative to repay. They're going to be sent somewhere else where there's still going to be negativity and violence. So we are really going to go into a new age, a new world. It'll be quite wonderful.
Is there a reason why they're contacting us now a lot more than before, or we're noticing it a lot more?
I think it's because it's getting time. We have got to that point. They still don't want to interfere, but it's getting more and more obvious that they're bringing it into our conscious now that they are here to help us.
If we were to become conscious enough as a race to ask for their help, would that be interference, or would we?
No, if we ask for their help, they'll give it gladly.
Okay.
But they can't interfere in our affairs. It's the same way with guides and guardian angels too. They can help you, but they can't make you do anything. That's interference. But if you ask for help, it's given. Pretty much the millennium begins, and when we go into the 1,000 years of peace, we're going to be having more open contact. We got to get through the violence. He said that's why we are isolated out here in our little part of the galaxy, because they're afraid of us. They're afraid of our violence, they're afraid of our emotions, and they don't want us to contaminate the rest of the galaxies. We get past that, then they will be given wonderful gifts where we're going to be evolving. And they said we will have open contact by that time. We'll be living in space, traveling in space, and be accepted. But we have to get this animalistic part out of us first, the wars and everything. Some of the ones that I have come up with in my cases. Some people say there's only 2 types. There's races out there of so many, many different types, you wouldn't believe it. As many as on Earth and more. Some types of life, you would look at them and you say, that can't possibly be intelligent. It could not possibly be alive. They said when people finally go to Mars, they said there's only rocks on Mars. They said, but you don't know what could be intelligent. Even things that we think of as rocks and plants are a superior type of life. So we can't use our own judgment on these things. But the ones that are coming to Earth and interacting with humans, I was told I've met different. The main one that they're talking about is the little grays, the little guys with the dark eyes. And of course, I don't see these as negative, because I've had so much contact with them. I think they're very lovable little guys. They are what I call androids. They are manufactured beings. They are used to perform the tasks. I compare it to like orderlies in a hospital. The room, and they take the the blood tests and everything, and the person saying, well, what are you doing this for? They don't know. They just go to the next room and take the other tests and take it back to the doctors who are doing the examinations. I compare them to those type of beings. They just do the job. And this is why they seem kind of detached, because they don't really understand themselves. They are afraid of emotions because they don't have any. Frightened or start screaming or something, it terrifies the poor little guys. They don't know why we are reacting in this way. But people look, if you understand how they are made, you wouldn't be so afraid of them. The black part of their eyes are not their eyes. Their eyes are covered with like a lens-like covering, like sunglasses, because they can't take the radiation of the sun. It is to protect them. They're very delicate, very weak. And I was surprised when I saw the alien autopsy film when they took a black membrane off of the eye. And it was a covering. And I said, I didn't think anybody else had got that information except me. And someone said, well, they got it out of your book, so they would know about it. And I said, no, that just has not been mentioned until now. I mention it in my new book, Legacy from the Stars, and I'm going to go into it more in my book I'm working on now. But it is that the eyes have a covering. The skin also has a covering, a total membrane that covers the entire body. Their skin is so delicate that if you blew on it, you would damage it. So from the time they are developed, they are totally encased in a membrane. They don't have any digestive system, they don't have an elimination system, so they don't have to worry about that. This is on their body their entire life. They can breathe through it like we would. You know, the pores, it'll go through it. And people think of them as being frightening because they see a mask-like appearance on their face. But most of these aliens have learned to communicate telepathically. No longer need the vocal cords, they no longer need the facial expressions. Also the digestive systems, everything have atrophied because they don't consume food the way we do. But if you don't have speech, the muscles of the face will eventually atrophy and turn into a mask-like appearance. I think we must look very strange to them. We're using all this body language all the time. Our mouths are always moving. We have all this noise coming out. They think we look very strange because they're doing mind-to-mind communication. They don't need any other thing else, no body language. They understand perfectly what it is they want to communicate. That's the reason why they're frightened of us. So you can see after a while, this would all turn into like a mask-like appearance. And we see that as frightening when actually they don't use the muscles anymore. These are the little grays that are the most predominant. As I said, manufactured to do the work of the other beings.
So they're more, not as highly evolved as other beings?
No, it'd be like we would consider to be a machine, although it is a sophisticated machine. It's an organic machine. It is physical. But they have got to the point where they can develop these to do their work for them. We'll probably do the same thing down the road. You know, we'll start out with robots, and we'll get more sophisticated robots to where it'll look alive. But it would never really be able to do the same functions as a higher being.
Do these grays have a soul or no?
I don't think they really do because they're more or less manufactured. But I don't see them as they just do what they're told. There's another type that we call the tall grays that are on the laboratory craft. There are some craft that are way high above the atmosphere. They're so large that they're called the motherships and they're called the laboratory crafts. They're so large they cannot come down and land. So they send the little crafts down with the little guys in them. But the tall ones are tall 7-foot grays that look very much like the small ones. And they take the samples that are brought back, and they're the ones that do the laboratory testing and the gene manipulation. And it would make sense that they would recreate the workers in their image, only a smaller version. But these are highly intelligent. They have very long, slender, beautiful. They are the ones who are the brains or the mind behind everything that's going on up there. So you could see of them as a worker. There are several other types of these little beings that have more intelligence. One was a rounded head type that had webbed fingers, and they had eyes with pupils, webbed fingers, and their feet were what we called mitten-type feet, like a duck would be, only if a duck had the skin come all the way over the feet with the thumb out here, you can see the bones in the feet. These type, when they go outside the craft, they cannot take the atmosphere, and they usually wear some kind of suits. because they are very susceptible to the bacteria and the germs in our air. So those type are the ones that go out and take soil samplings, pick up grass and bugs and things like that for testing. But that is a very gentle, benign creature also. They're very small. We have another type that I call the nurse type. She has wrinkled skin. I say she, feeling it's a female, even though it doesn't look like a female. They get a female personality off of it. It's a very wrinkled type, almost elephant type skin with little whiffs of hair. But when they see this one, is that they're on the craft and they're doing the testing and they're frightened, they don't know what's happening. This one comes up and stands next to them and stares at them, and it's almost like, it's okay, it's all right, relax. Well, I call it the nurse, because we don't care, but sometimes one nurse might come in and talk to you and everything's all right again. I kind of put her in that category, but she is on a lot of the crafts, this type, to kind of just, calm down, it's okay, everything's going to be all right. Then we have the insect type. This is the ones that look like giant praying mantis with the arms and the eyes. And they're frightening to a lot of people. But it's almost like all these different races on the ship, the same way with them. And they said, it doesn't mean any of them are better than, worse than, they're all different than. And the insect type perceives its environment in a different way. This is why they seem to be cold and detached, which we think of as insects. But one trait they have is people always report a very bad smell around that type when they're around them. But they also do a lot of, they take reports and things like this. This type has been seen by many people and always frightens them. And then you have the reptilians. You've heard a lot about the reptilians. I've only had that have looked like giants. Only had 2 person report a reptilian. Both cases, they seem to be in an underground setting, a tunnel or a cave or something, because one time there was a wall and it had like letters, some kind of writing on the wall. And I don't know if this is an underground setting on Earth or another planet, but those types have always been seen not on a craft but underground. But that could just have been these cases. There may be other ones when they're on board a craft. Then you have your beautiful blonde humanoid types that people talk about. This is the ones that are in the Billy Meyer case, Yamyasi, and other ones talk about these look like Greek gods. Blonde, very beautiful, very handsome. But I found out in my work that it's not the way they look. It's what's called a screen memory, or I call them overlays. To protect the human's consciousness, they can make things appear any way they want, so you will not be frightened. This is why many people see animals and see them as owls. It's an overlay to protect what they really look like. Because I've taken them through cases where we have asked the subconscious, does this being really look like this, the big beautiful blondes? And they'll say no. The features are more distorted and alien looking, but they don't want to frighten the person, so they make them see them in that way. And then there are the other kinds that are pure energy that can make a body to appear any way they want. They can appear as a human, they can appear as an animal, to fit in. And they would be walking around the streets and living among us as observers. But when they return to their real form, they are pure energy. And those are the main types that I've had contact with anyway.
Have you seen all these types personally, or only through?
Okay. No, I have never seen anything myself. It's always through the people I work with. I consider myself the reporter, the accumulator of evidence, and I can stand back and put everything in categories as the experimentee. And so that book, I ended up adding 4 more chapters to the end to show how it comes full circle, the reason why they were still coming. But it was something that was unknown to either one of us. But with the idea of the seeding of the planet Earth, they have been taking care of us since the very beginning. And there are councils, we are told, over different levels. And they are over different galaxies, over solar systems. There's different, like a pecking order over there. And they have definite rules and regulations that they go by. And they said when a planet reaches its state where it can support life, has developed to that stage, it is given its life charter. This means then that the different races will come here and try to determine what kind of life will grow here. And they have to experiment to find out what it is. And it goes from a cellular stage, and they watch it as it develops. This is a very long, time-consuming process. It will go on for eons of time, with different people being involved in the development of the race. And it was decided to give Earth a creature with knowledge and free will, and see what he does with it. And I've often wondered, what do they think we're doing with this free will? Are we doing what they intended? And the Star Trek directive of non-interference is very real, because once they give it, you're not supposed to interfere, see what they'll do with it and how they will develop. I'm Dolores Cannon, and I've been a hypnotherapist for 18 years. I started in 1979, and I specialize in past life therapy and past life regressions. This is where you take the person back into the other lifetimes to find the answers to problems in this lifetime. So I've been doing this as a hypnotherapist for 18 years. And 10 years ago, they asked me to be a UFO investigator. They needed someone who could use hypnosis into the abduction cases, and they wanted someone who could take them back into that. So they asked me to come in as an investigator to help them on those cases.
So how did you get started in doing this?
Okay, but my roots in hypnosis actually go back into the 1960s. So I was trained in the old methods, the watch the shiny object, the ones that are very long inductions, and those are not used anymore. They're too time consuming. And during those early days of doing habits, losing weight, stop smoking, by accident, a woman we were working with went back into a past life. And it was the beginning of this whole adventure. There were no books in that time to guide you, no books to tell you how to do this. We were more or less blazing our own trail of how to, remembering some snatches of an event, or they may be having dreams, and all they can remember is that something horrible happened, is the way they interpret it. They think it's something very evil or menacing. And a lot of the investigators, they keep them at that level, and there's a great deal of fear based there. But when I take the person back and they are on board a craft, I go beyond that to where they're no longer frightened, to go to the subconscious and say what is really occurring. And when I do that, we find there's a whole other set of circumstances, because the subconscious knows what really is going on. And it will tell you the exact procedures and everything, and it's really not frightening at all. The person has remembered it through a distorted memory.
So how did the first alien memory surface in a past life?
Well, the first case that I ever did was actually before I began doing investigations. It was a young man, the subject of my book, Keepers of the Garden. I call it Keepers of the Garden because it's we are the garden and they are the gardeners. It's the ancient astronaut theory that the Von Daniken first coined that term a long time ago, talking about the seeding of the planet Earth. And this young man, we just wanted to go back and look for past lives. Instead, we found that this was his first life on Earth. He had never lived on Earth before. All his other lifetimes had taken place on other planets and other dimensions. So I thought this would be interesting, and we went through these different lifetimes. And then suddenly, they began telling us the story of the seeding of the planet Earth and the beginnings of Earth. And it was very fascinating, going back to the beginning of time. And it was the book was finished, and I was sending it off to publishers when I got into the UFO work. And the young man, Phil, told me that for years he had had these strange dreams. And he had had an experience where he woke up very frightened many years before. And he said, do you think there's anything to that? In the early days of my investigation, I thought the person had to have an actual sighting to have actually seen something physical or remembered something happening to them. I didn't realize that the capacity of the subconscious to hide things, which is better, they don't have anything to disturb him all their life. It's hidden in the subconscious, but in order to have a conscious memory. So when he's telling me about waking up in the middle of the night, absolutely terrified and having these strange dreams, I thought there's nothing to it. But we pursued it anyway, and we found a whole another hidden list of experiences there. He had contact since the time he was 10 years old, and he'd been on the craft many times, and he was part of the experiments. And they said it was because in the other lifetimes he was the alien, he was the experimenter, that now in this life he had agreed to be on the other side, do a reincarnation hypnosis into that. But even though it was a very startling case and it changed my whole belief system on what's out there, I had to put it on the back burner. I had to wait until my children were grown, because my husband was almost killed. He was in a wheelchair for 25 years. Our whole life was changed. And I had to wait till my children were grown before I could pursue hypnosis again. So in 1979, they were married and off to college, and so I was like, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? What I chose to do with the rest of my life is not what the normal housewife chooses to do. I wanted to get back into hypnosis, and I wanted to become a writer. So I studied the modern methods, which are much faster. They deal with visualization and imagery. And from there, I developed my own technique, which puts the person into the deepest possible level of trance, which is the somnambulistic level. You can't go any deeper than that, but many hypnotists do not want to work in that level because strange things can happen there, because all conscious mind interference into that level. And that's why I think I'm getting a different kind of information than the other UFO investigators. I work in this deep, deep level. I'm able to contact the subconscious directly. Many other of the UFO investigators are staying in what is called the emotional level. They don't go into the level where you find the real information. In the emotional level, the person may be